welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to tackle a concept that's been a real head-scratcher for philosophers for centuries, dualism. Specifically, we're looking at how it applies to the philosophy of mind. We're going through some pretty dense excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so think of us as your guides through all the jargon and complex ideas.
Exactly. We're going to explore what it really means to say that the mind and body are distinct entities. And trust me, some of the arguments both for A and D against this idea are surprisingly compelling.
Yeah, it's a real philosophical rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So let's start with like the most basic question. What's the relationship between the mind and body? Isn't this the heart of what's called the mind-body problem?
Absolutely. And, the problem really comes up because mental properties, things like consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, they just seem so fundamentally different from physical properties like height, weight, or brain activity. Mental properties are subjective, meaning, you have this direct access to your own experiences in a way that nobody else does.
Right. It's like your inner world is totally unique to you.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's where dualism comes in. It's the idea that the mental and the physical are these radically different kinds of things.
Okay, so how far back did this idea go? Like, how have philosophers throughout history approached dualism?
Well, it goes way, way back. Plato, for example, he believed in this realm of forms, these like eternal, immaterial entities that make the world intelligible. He saw the intellect as immaterial because it could grab these forms, which were themselves immaterial. Essentially, for Plato, the mind transcended the physical world.
So Plato was all about the mind's ability to connect with something beyond the physical world.
That's interesting. What about his student Aristotle? Did he agree with that?
Well, Aristotle had a slightly different take. You see, he believed that the soul was the form of the body. But, like Plato, he also argued for the immateriality of the intellect. His reasoning was that if the intellect were material, then it would be limited in what it could think about, just like our senses are limited. But, we can think about anything, which suggests that the intellect must be immaterial. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if our thoughts were just physical processes, maybe we'd be stuck thinking only about concrete things. But it's like our minds can wander anywhere, right?
Right. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the 17th century to René Descartes. He really solidified this idea of substance dualism, the belief that the mind and body are distinct substances. He saw the mind as being characterized by thought and the body by its physical extension.
Gotcha. So Descartes kind of formalized this division between mental and physical stuff. But if they're so fundamentally different, how can they possibly interact? I mean, how can a thought, which is immaterial, cause my arm to move, which is physical?
That's the million-dollar question. It's known as the problem of interactionism. And yeah, it's a really tough one to crack.
It really is. It's like trying to picture how a ghost could move a solid object. It just doesn't compute.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. And even Descartes himself struggled with this. Some of his followers went so far as to suggest that God must intervene every single time there's a mind-body interaction.
Oh, wow. So it's not so much interaction as it is divine intervention. Interesting workaround, but maybe a bit extreme, even for philosophers.
Yeah, you could say that. But the point is, the interaction problem highlights the central tension in dualism. And it's important to remember that not all dualists agree on the extent of the separation between mind and body. There are actually different types of dualism. We've got predicate dualism, which is actually more about language than existence.
Okay, so predicate dualism, what's that all about?
Basically, it argues that you need different kinds of language to describe mental and physical phenomena. So it's the weakest form of dualism because it doesn't necessarily say that immaterial things actually exist. But it does highlight these distinct categories we use when we talk about the mind versus the body.
So even the way we use language suggests this fundamental difference in how we think about the two. Huh. Fascinating. What about the types of dualism that deal with the mind actually existing?
Right. Let's move on to property dualism. This one says that even if mental and physical properties are found in the same object, like, say, a human being, they're still fundamentally different types of properties.
Can you give me an example, just to make sure I'm following?
Think about the experience of pain. A property dualist would say that the feeling of pain isn't just the same as a description of brain states or nerve firings. It's that subjective feeling, what philosophers call qualia, that makes pain, well, painful.
So, like, even if we could map out every neuron firing in your brain when you stub your toe, that still wouldn't capture what it feels like to be in pain.
You got it. And this brings us to substance dualism. This is like the most hardcore version of dualism. It's the view that the mind and body are totally distinct substances, meaning they could exist independently of each other.
Ah, so this brings us right back to that interaction problem, right?
Yeah.
If they're entirely separate, how can they possibly influence one another?
You're exactly right. And this is where things get really tricky. Because of this problem, some dualists have proposed alternative views like epiphenomenalism.
Epi what now?
Epiphenomenalism. I know, it's a mouthful. But basically, it says that mental events are caused by physical events, but have no causal influence back on the physical. It's like saying your mind is a shadow cast by your body. It's there, but it doesn't actually do anything.
Whoa. So our thoughts and feelings wouldn't have any impact on our actions. That's a pretty radical view.
It is, and it faces some pretty serious objections. For one thing, it goes against our intuition that our mental states do influence our actions. Think about it. The pain you feel when you touch a hot stove causes you to pull your hand away. It's not like your hand just moves on its own.
Yeah, good point. Plus, that raises questions about how we'd even know other people have minds if their mental states don't cause any outwardly observable behavior.
Exactly. Then there's parallelism. This is another attempt to solve the interaction problem. This view suggests that the mind and body are like two perfectly synchronized clocks that keep the same time, but don't actually influence each other.
Unless there's some divine clockmaker keeping them in sync, it seems like a pretty wild coincidence.
Right. So, as you can see, the interaction problem poses this huge hurdle for dualism, and it leads to all these complex philosophical puzzles.
Definitely. So we've covered the historical background and the different types of dualism, but now I'm really curious about the arguments in favor of dualism. What makes this view so appealing to some philosophers?
That is a great question, and that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. All right, so are you ready to dive into some of the arguments that make dualism so compelling?
Absolutely, let's hear.
Okay, great. So a lot of these arguments are kind of pushing back against the opposite view, which is called physicalism. Physicalism says that everything, even the mind, can be explained in terms of physical processes, like in the brain.
Okay, so how do dualists challenge that? What are their main arguments?
One of the most famous arguments against physicalism and for dualism is called the knowledge argument. It's a thought experiment that really gets at the limits of explaining consciousness just through physical facts.
A thought experiment. I love those.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk me through this one.
All right, so picture this. There's this brilliant scientist named Mary, and she's lived her entire life in a black and white room. She's got access to all the scientific knowledge imaginable about color vision, physics, neurophysiology, everything. But she's never actually seen color.
Okay, so she knows all the facts about color, but has never experienced it directly. I think I see where you're going with this.
Exactly. Now imagine one day Mary leaves the room and sees a red apple for the very first time. The question is, does she learn anything new?
Well, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
She'd finally know what it feels like to see red. All the science in the world couldn't teach her that.
Exactly. And that's the core of the knowledge argument. It suggests that there's something about the subjective experience of color, that qualia of redness, that can't be captured by physical facts alone. It means there's more to consciousness than just the physical stuff.
So even if we knew every single thing about how the physical world works, we'd still be missing something crucial when it comes to subjective experience.
Right. And this leads some folks to believe that the mind must be more than just the brain.
That's a pretty powerful argument.
Yeah.
Are there other arguments that support this idea? You know, the idea that the mind is more than just the brain?
There are. Another one is the modal argument. This one revolves around the idea that you can imagine your mind existing without your body.
Well, I do spend a lot of time in my head.
Right. Well, the modal argument takes that intuition and runs with it. It says that if it's conceivable for your mind to exist without your body, then it might also be possible. And if it's possible, then the mind and body must be distinct things.
Okay, I follow the logic there. But couldn't a physicalist just argue that just because we can imagine something, that doesn't mean it's actually possible?
Oh, they definitely could. But that opens up a whole other can of worms about, what we can and cannot conceive of and whether conceivability tells us anything about possibility at all. Those are some deep philosophical waters.
So we've got the knowledge argument, the modal argument, both suggesting that physicalism might be missing something important. What other arguments do dualists use?
Well, there are also arguments from personal identity. These focus on the unique problems that counterfactuals about a person's origin raise for personal identity, problems that wouldn't really apply to, say, physical objects.
Counterfactuals. I'm not sure I'm following you. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Imagine someone asks you, if you'd had different parents, would you still be you? This kind of gets at the difference between personal identity and the identity of, let's say, a rock.
Right, with a rock, it's all about his physical properties.
Yep.
But with a person, it seems like there's something more to it.
Exactly. And dualists argue that this something more is tied to this immaterial soul or mind, something beyond just the physical body.
So even if we could create a perfect physical copy of you, it wouldn't truly be you because it wouldn't have that unique immaterial essence.
That's the idea. This line of thinking even leads some dualists to believe that the self must be simple, meaning it can't be made up of parts, because if it were made up of parts, we'd just run into the same problems we have with defining the identity of physical objects.
Hmm. It's like trying to grab onto the source of our identity and it keeps slipping through our fingers. But if it's not in our bodies, where is it?
That's the big question dualism is wrestling with. Some dualists, building on Aristotle's ideas, say that physical systems just aren't capable of genuine thought. They point to stuff like the frame problem in artificial intelligence, for example.
The what problem?
The frame problem.
And
It's basically pointing out the difficulty of designing an AI that can understand context and common sense the way humans do.
so it's that classic idea that a computer can only do what it's programmed to do. It lacks the real insight and flexibility of human thought.
Right, and dualists would say that's because genuine thought needs something more than just physical processes. They also bring up Benesaraf's problem. This one asks how a physical brain can interact with abstract objects, things like numbers or concepts.
Yeah, that is a real head-scratcher. If thoughts are just physical processes, how can they be about something that exists outside the physical realm?
Exactly. So you've got all these different arguments pointing to the idea that there's something about the mind that a purely physical explanation just can't fully capture. The knowledge argument, the modal argument, arguments from personal identity, and these challenges to physicalist theories of thought. It's a pretty compelling case for dualism, wouldn't you say?
I have to admit, it's pretty convincing. But I know there are counter-arguments too, right? Dualism isn't without its critics. What are some of the main challenges that dualists have to address?
You're right. Dualism definitely has its problems. One of the biggest is the problem of the unity of the mind.
Okay, what's that one all about?
Well, dualism says that the mind is separate from the body, right? But then how do we explain how all the different parts and properties of the mind come together to make a single unified entity? If the mind is immaterial, what's holding it all together?
It's like that image of the mind as a bundle of thoughts and feelings. But if there's nothing actually holding the bundle together, how can we even talk about a unified self?
That's the challenge. And it applies to both substance dualists who believe in an immaterial soul and those who favor what's called a bundle theory of the self. They both got to explain how the mind maintains its internal coherence.
So it's not just the interaction problem. Dualists also have to explain how the mind itself stays unified. Are there any other big criticisms of dualism?
Another major one is what's called the queerness of the mental.
Queerness. That's an interesting choice of words. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, if the mind is not physical, it seems like it's got some really strange properties, things like subjectivity and intentionality.
We talked about subjectivity earlier, the idea that we each have this unique first-person access to our own experiences.
Right. And then there's intentionality. This
Mhm.
refers to the aboutness of mental states. Like your thoughts, beliefs, and desires are all directed towards something. You think about things, believe in things, desire certain things.
Like our minds can reach out and touch the world, even parts that don't physically exist.
Exactly. And this aboutness is tough to explain if the mind is totally separate from the physical world. It's not a property we usually give to physical objects. So this queerness of the mental makes it hard to fit into a purely physicalist view of the world.
So it seems like we're left with this tension. On one hand, we have compelling arguments saying the mind is more than just the brain. But on the other hand, there are these deep conceptual challenges. The interaction problem, the unity of the mind, and the queerness of the mental dualism is both really appealing and incredibly perplexing.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. It offers this way of understanding ourselves that really resonates with how we think about the specialness of consciousness and thought. But it comes with some serious philosophical baggage.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. So where does all this leave us?
Well, that's exactly what we'll explore in the final part of this deep dive. Stick around.
Okay, so we've really gone deep into this whole mind-body problem, huh? Traced the history of dualism, looked at different types, and weighed the arguments for and against it.
Yeah, it's been a real journey for sure. And I think what's clear is that it's a really complex issue with no easy answers. This debate's still raging on in philosophy today.
Definitely a lot to unpack. So where does all this leave us? What are the big takeaways from exploring dualism?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that dualism, in its various forms, it really presents a strong alternative to those purely physical explanations of the mind. All those arguments we talked about, the ones about qualia, the modal argument, personal identity, and the challenges to physicalism, they all kind of point to the limitations of saying that the mind is nothing more than brain activity.
Right. It's like dualism acknowledges that there's this gap between our subjective experience and the objective world. It's saying there's something about what it's like to be conscious, to think, that can't be fully described by science.
You got it. And even though dualism has those, pretty serious challenges, the interaction problem, the unity of the mind, the queerness of the mental, those don't necessarily mean that the basic insights of dualism are wrong. They just mean we have to think even harder about what the mind is, what the body is, and how they relate.
So maybe instead of seeing them as roadblocks, those challenges are more like invitations to keep exploring.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Dualism might not have all the answers, but it definitely brings up the right questions. It makes us grapple with the mystery of consciousness and consider the possibility that reality might be bigger than what science can currently explain.
I like that, leaving room for the mystery. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine, just for a second, that we could actually prove that a soul or a mind separate from the body exists. What would that mean for how we live? How would that change our understanding of morality, responsibility, even the meaning of life itself?
Whoa, those are some huge questions. It would definitely shake things up, wouldn't it?
It sure would. And with that thought-provoking image, we'll leave you to think about those profound implications. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.